Welcome back, everybody. We are having another installment of the forum here today with Anthony Panke and Jason Tang. Thank you for joining me. Today, we're going to talk about part one of the interview with Professor Heinrich August Winkler. This part of the interview deals primarily with the conception of the West and its historic origins. Just a few words on Professor Winkler. He is definitely one of the most eminent historians in Germany, and his biggest opus basically is the history of the West. It's 4 volumes. He's also a frequent commentator on current events in the German media. And the interview was conducted in the context of Sonia and myself doing interviews for our second book, The Crisis of the West, Part 2, Germany, The New Divide, ? So I want to also give credit to the people who have helped sort of translate this interview, which were Emma Lücke, Nora Lücke, and Sonia, who edited part of the interview with Professor Winkler himself. And the other part of the interview will be published successively on our Substack. If you're interested in reading part 1 and the other parts for free, you can go to transatlantika.substack.com. And then hopefully, that's at least the plan, we will publish the entire interview in our first print issue of the Cable this fall. So, as I mentioned already, the first part of the interview, which is quite lengthy, is concerned mostly with the conception of the West. And Professor Winkler gave us sort of a nice historic sort of run through of how the West, came about throughout, starting in the Middle Ages, right, and then going all the way to the what he calls the Atlantic Revolutions, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And the initial question that I had was that when you talk about the West, I mean, it's a central term that we use in our work with Transatlantika. It's all about the crisis of the West. But a lot of times the term the West is sort of frowned upon in academia, but also just in general. Do we want to start off there, guys? Anthony, maybe? How do you see that in academia? You're the professor, you're teaching in California.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned like the West. I think there is, I would say in the last 20 years, maybe not that long, 10 years, like a questioning of the West. And I think, at least, so if you ask me, questioning of the West, what's behind that? It's probably colonialism. So there is this idea that, and you see this in popular discussions of, especially in terms of how the U.S. was settled, and then you have the introduction of, but then like the popularization of concepts like settler colonialism, and along with that, more attention to slavery as institution, and so you have those phenomenon really, I think, dominating the questions of the West, and I think, and those things have to be unpacked. And I think the Winkler article, if you want to, or the interview, if you want to talk about it at some point, I think there's debates like, what's the truth of the West? Is the truth democracy and discussion, or freedom of speech and individual liberties, and then colonialism and so on? They're like there, but they're not the root. Or is colonialism the root, and these other things just kind of there? Like, or is it like a back and forth? I think that's a big question. Then you talk about the universities, though. I think what's happened, and I saw this when I was a graduate student. I was actually just looking it up because I was curious if there still was. When I was a grad student in Minnesota, there was classes on like ancient political theory, and it was the canon, so-called canon, and it was like Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, and it was basically Europeans. And then there was questioning of the canon, which began when when I was a grad student was 2005 to 2013, so 20 years ago. And there was questioning of the canon. But I was just looking it up now. Those classes are still offered. So ancient political theory is still offered, and like early modern political theory they're still on the books. So I think there is an ongoing discussion of like what's the canon, and then also I think what is the West. And at the same time, you can't deny that the West, for good or for bad, dominates the globe. Like there's things that came out of the West, like the state, whatever you think about the state, capitalism, however you think about capitalism, those things came out of Europe and then they became global. So I don't know. So that's like a quick reaction.
Actually, that's a great start. I already took notes on a bunch of stuff, and I gonna follow up. But I want to give Jason a chance to chip in first.
I mean, I guess just thinking about it, like the whole debate of like what is the West has been going on pretty much since the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Like when Voltaire was calling like the Holy Roman Empire neither holy nor Roman nor empire, like, and like the Western Europeans always refer to the Byzantines as Greeks. And not in sort of like that was meant as euphemism, or like it wasn't meant to be nice to them. They were like, because they were the Western Europeans were the actual kind of successors to Rome, and not kind of like, not the Byzantines. And yeah, you can see Western thought, like even like, okay, the capitalism definitely comes from the West, right? Marx was not actually a Chinese philosopher. He was, I mean, he was a Western dude too. Right, so the two dominant like strains. I mean, to the extent that you believe that like China or like North Korea are communist states, like I mean, they've become the dominant strains of what. Like, is that part of the West as well? Like, would you consider? Because I mean, like, Marx was also not Russian, right? I mean, he didn't think. So the question is like, should we consider the Soviet Union part of the West? Because it falls in intellectual tradition, right? A different intellectual tradition, but. Like, I think Winkler notes, or am I getting ahead of it myself? But like, yeah, Winkler notes in his piece that, like, like during the Yalta conference, that's when we made the split between the West and the rest. Right. So in some sense, like that, maybe that is something of an artificial divide. But like a lot of the stuff, like all of the fighting we see in the Middle East and Africa, right? I mean, granted, there's always been violence like there, but like the fact that it's come sort of like the state sponsored, like drawn out, I mean, like leftovers from like the Western colonial project of like, let's just draw lines here and hope it works out.
Okay, wow, yeah, no, this is amazing. I was like, do we have enough for an hour? And I'm like, okay, we have enough for 3 hours conversation. If we're not going to do that, no worries. But where to start? Well, let's actually start with Professor Winkler's sort of story of the West, right? Because he says it goes back to the investiture controversy in the 11th and 12th century, and then the splitting of Rome basically in the Byzantine Orthodox part, and then in the Latin speaking sort of Western part. But then he also very clearly says that the West as a normative project sort of only came about with those two Atlantic revolutions. And again, his whole thinking has been really formative for my own thinking about the West, because I think this is sort of what a lot of people, we always hear politicians, especially in times of crisis or war, Ukraine conflict was a dominant example. They always sort of call on the Western values, and that we got to protect them, and so on and so on. And the question then always is sort of, what are those values, right? And if you go back to then those two revolutions, it becomes a bit more clear to Winkler, or he says in essence that it's human rights, right? So it's freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, equality before the law, so justice for all, disregarding on whether you're a woman, what color you are, and so on. And the key then, and this is, I think, where we really get to points that both of you made, is that there is the promise of the West and then the actual practice, right? And we just did the last retreat for the weekend for the year, and this is where I really had a nice. I'm gonna maybe do a video of this someday where I film it, but you can draw it very nicely where you have the sort of discrepancy between the promise and sort of the practice of the West. And this is where we get to the colonialism problem, right? And where we get to the issue of slavery, and where we get to the issue of women's rights and rights of everybody. Because, as Winkler says, even though the founding fathers, and that's already so obviously, right? It's fathers, there's no mother. But the sort of ideas encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence, which has its 250 years anniversary next year, by the way, just for everybody to, heads up. The ideas encapsulated there, and also in the documents that came out of the French Revolution, sort of basically entailed universal human rights. And sort of they created a basis for people who didn't have those rights at the time to later ask for them and fight for them, right? And I think this is always it's been my reaction for a long time, because there are people who are saying we shouldn't talk about the West, or we shouldn't celebrate it. And I'm not sure I'm even celebrating it. It's just sort of the culture where I, for example, came from. But what is special about the West is that it actually entails the very ideas and norms that make people ask for those rights that they have been denied in practice, right? And this is sort of the cool thing, I guess. It's the unique thing about the West, which, and actually, this is what I call the best of the West, right? So that was a lot, and Jason has to chuckle. So
I just thinking of like a PowerPoint presentation by some consultant saying like the unique selling point of the West is, like liberalism. You have the SWOT, strength, weaknesses, opportunity, threats. Sorry.
Absolutely, I think this is. I mean, and it took me years to think about it. I mean, when we started the Trump project, and then I wasn't sure what we're actually talking about when we're talking about the West. And I think a lot of people don't. And this is why I asked Heinrich August Winkler those questions, right? Because a lot of very big politicians throw that term around all the time and don't really know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. But this is really what makes it special. And this is why there's a lot of people also coming to the West, right? It's not just economic opportunities. It's also that you have the opportunity to, based on those principles, also to ask for these rights that you might not always get in practice, which is it's a huge problem. That's the hypocrisy of the West. And you see it, I mean, there's so many examples of it. But the idea of progress is sort of built into it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anthony looks very thoughtful, and
I was thinking of a couple of things. Like I think I was thinking of like C.L.R. James in his book The Black Jacobins, which I think speaks to your point, actually. So C.L.R. James, for those who don't know, he writes basically the first book about the Haitian Revolution. It's 1930 something. Nobody wrote about the Haitian Revolution. It's the only successful slave revolution in history, right? And people just wrote it off. And he really writes the first book. And it's interesting because the book talks about slavery and how terrible, especially in the Caribbean, it is. In the 1700s and in the early 1800s, but it's really how the slaves start hearing in different ways with the different individuals. You have Toussaint Louverture and so on, who are particular important figures, but the slaves start hearing about the French Revolution and they go, oh, we want that too. We want freedom. And the owners say, yes, wait, not for you. Not for you. You don't get slave. You're a slave. You don't get freedom. And it turned violent, of course. But Haiti, and then there's another story of Haitian independence after the conflicts, but the Haitian Revolution in a way is a continuation. It's actually the truth of the French Revolution, and it happens in a slave society. So it's outside of Europe, and it takes non-Europeans to actually actualize the truth of the French Revolution. And that doesn't, I think some people, what does that mean? I think there's a way to read that as a point supporting your point, Tim, about the like we're speaking, like the Haitians, the slaves didn't say, oh, you know what? Oh, the French Revolution is a disaster. We don't want to participate in that at all. They drew inspiration from the French Revolution for their own revolution, and actually against the French, right? There's that point. The other point, though, and I wonder about this, I really, and I don't have a good answer, but I'm just thinking about like how I think both on the left and right now, I think there's a certain like praise for the past, and I think there's a lot of like the past in the sense of like I know that like a lot of the post-colonial or decolonial theories, folks who really lift up like indigenous voices, there's an ambiguity there of like a explicitly like non-Western, you can talk about knowledges, ways of growing food, ways of forming political community that are not Western. And there's an idea like prior to colonization, there was a way of doing things, and those things need to be brought back. And I feel like now, is that possible? That's one thing. Second thing is, do folks, even like in reservations, current reservations, do they want my daughters here too? But do people like how much is it possible? How much do people want those things? But I think there is a current on the, I think maybe, I don't know, maybe on the left, I think there's some people on the far right too that say like there's a pre-capitalist, almost like pre-Western moment that we need to go back to. If you want to go talk to them about the fascists, you have like Julius Evola from Italy writing about like these natural hierarchies in society. Slavery is a good thing. And so I think there's this look towards the past around the political spectrum, which is, I think, anti-Western. Now, so I don't know. That's like a few comments.
There's also like a modernist take on it too, right? Like you have like back when, hello. Yeah, back when I was in college, like the East Asian Challenge to Human Rights, right? The so-called like, the Lee Kuan Yew / like, and also like you have modern philosophers like Curtis Yarvin and like Chao Gongqin, who kind of argue more along the lines of basically saying that like what we need is kind of like a CEO in chief. But I guess like we often forget. I feel like there's not enough attention. Or maybe it's like because why did liberals come about, right? I guess my kind of like the way I connected in my brain is that you have like when Martin Luther did his equivalent of like a blog post by hammering those things in the church, right? The European response was like, okay, let's just kill each other over it. This seems like a perfectly reasonable response to this. I mean, after like a century or so of just murdering each other, they were like, maybe we should try something else. And that's where I imagine sort of like the first season, I mean, like, hey, maybe like words are just words and we shouldn't go murdering each other for it. This isn't like, I guess like this is the only thing I remember or like understood out of Hegel was like thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So we had the thesis of like words are just words. We had the antithesis of like the postmodernism, like no, actually words are a form of violence, not exactly equivalent to violence, but a form of violence. Maybe we're trying to like find some of the synthesis between that now. I don't know.
Oh. All right. I'm going to pick up on a point that Anthony said. Sorry, I just muted you for a second, Anthony, because we got some back and forth. Yes. Wow. And I think this conversation already shows that once you sort of actually try to grab the whole concept, it gets really tricky very quickly. Non-Western, looking at the past and non-Western cultures, are they even possible today? Yes, I think so. I think I actually one of my biggest, I think, uneasiness about Western foreign policy, if you want to call it that, is actually I do share John Mearsheimer's point. I think it's problematic that Western countries go around the world and, as he put it, put a gun to people's head and tell them what toilet paper to use. I think that's very problematic. So it's also, if I'm good and we're lucky, we're going to have a Russian on a special forum, basically an interview with me and a Russian who fled Russia or left Russia because he was part of the democracy movement. When you talk to somebody who actually lived there, and he's partly Chinese too. So when you talk to someone from an explicit, very non-Western country, in his case, he actually thinks they do need Western values in the long run. However, I also think there is no need for everybody to be Western. I mean, we don't need to have necessarily a purely Western culture all around the world. And it's also very tricky. I mean, are the Japanese Western? Yes and no. Some sort of their political system might in some ways be very Westernized, but their culture in a lot of ways is definitely not Western, right? Talking about and this is where the definitional stuff becomes more important. And it's something that is left open a bit by Professor Winkler as well, because I mean he's also doing a huge stretch of history. And it's sort of he doesn't clearly define what sort of the best of the West, as we would call it, actually is. What are those self-correcting mechanisms, right? And this is, I think, this is what makes the West unique, are those self-correcting mechanisms. I would say it's democracy, it's liberalism in a lot of ways, also liberal law, and freedom of speech. And well, I will get to that in a second. But one point I wanted to make, especially with regard to Anthony, is that I think it's easier, it helps if we clearly define what the West is, in order to also distinguish it from what other cultures maybe bring to the table, which, and they clearly do bring a lot to the table. And I at least don't think that everybody needs to be Western, like most foreign ministers of our countries seem to think at times, I think. So, yeah, there was a lot of confused stuff. Maybe let me actually take the next step though. The self-correcting mechanism. This is sort of something I've been like thinking about for a long time, and it's kind of tricky. It's like, so again, the idea is Western practices, or like colonialism, racism internally, are clearly contradicting the values of the West, or the West as a normative project. It's the promise, right? And what brings it together again is this self-correcting mechanism. And what we call the crisis of the West then is essentially the notion, and this is where I think we part ways to some extent with Professor Winkler. What we call the crisis of the West is the intuition that that self-correcting mechanism is failing. And this is sort of what we're trying to, or have been trying to work out for the last couple of years, right? If you have sort of a model of democracy, and this is what, again, we do at the retreat, we sort of draw it, and I hope to draw it for you guys too. If people are increasingly unable to have critical debates, then the self-correcting mechanism doesn't work as well, right? If you have a media that's very sort of politically biased on both sides, then it doesn't really fulfill its function anymore within a democracy, and then you have that mechanism fails as well. And I think that a lot of people actually do have the feeling that they don't have a way to sort of call out the practices of the West, which are sort of violating the promise. Right. Okay. That was a very long walk, but yes, Anthony, you would need to unmute yourself if you want to chip in. Go.
That's okay. Well, I was thinking there's a couple of things. Like you mentioned defining the West. One thing is, it's tough. I don't know. I don't know if we're going to get it now, but like one thing, at least in the U.S. context, like you have like, how do you think of U.S. of democracy? Like, do you think about it like it has its roots in Montesquieu, separation of powers, and French thinking? Or do you, those people who say, no, actually you need to pay attention to the Iroquois Confederacy and how they operated in terms of consensus and debate and their institutional structures? Like, how much did the U.S. founders and politicians like draw from that, which is clearly not Western? Like, and meanwhile, the Iroquois Confederacy also was violent. Like, Iroquois drove people western, so it's like, how much what counts as West is a big question in general. And also, I think that's what the root of the colonial critique, for lack of better terms, is like what we think is a unit is actually constituted by what's outside of it, right? That's like the basic point. There's a book. There's probably probably an analysis of the rights of man about this too. But like, I think of a book. There's a book by Anne Stoller. It's about gender. It's called like Race and the Education of Desire. She writes about like French colonials going to, I believe it's French Indochina at the time, and how people would go from France. They went to go live in Indochina, and then then people in France started seeing that there was mixed race families. And they were like, oh my gosh, who are these people? Who counts as French? Who counts as a man? Who counts as white? And they start having those conversations, not because of anything, not because of what's happening in France, but actually because of what's happening in the colony. The colony, the experience there, seeing people who did not look French, typically French, spurred people to have these conversations about what does it mean to be French. And that could be the same thing with like the West. Like, what do we mean by the West? How much is constituted by the quote unquote like non-Western? But it's like, I don't know what to say. I also, part of me also, if I be a little long-winded, like, I don't know how much of this is really about capitalism. Like, honestly, just so simple. Like, markets going around the world and forcing people to come together. Like, that's, and then we're buying things from one another. We're exchanging things with one another. People want to make money. It seems to be something that appeals to people everywhere. I don't know of any system that really has been just so, I mean, it's global, and it has been for hundreds of years. So if you take capitalism out of the equation, do you have the West? And I don't know if that's good or bad. Some people say capitalism is the best thing ever. Other people will criticize up and down, but it exists. So there's a couple ideas.
Well, I gotta jump in right there. I mean, the state, you mentioned it earlier, right? The entire world is covered in states. So that's a Western notion pretty much, and in its the modern state at least. And when we're talking about and I do this in this article from 2024, The Crisis of the West and a New Beginning, that's where I talk about sort of what I see as the causes of the crisis of the West. And that's basically the evolution. And that sort of goes back to a story by Habermas, not even though those guys know each other, but it's basically the evolution of the capitalist system and the state and their symbiotic relationship. How, the markets need rules and property rights, the state needs taxes, and so they both grow and grow and grow and grow, and that's basically then the colonization of the life world. There we have the colonial idea again, and it's the same sort of process. It pervades our life deep more and more, and this is why people sort of feel they have no more agency, and they're sort of it destroys solidarity, social integration, and all these things. As to your first point, real quick, I don't think the discussion about the West is whether it's a purely European thing or European/American thing. I mean, we're called Transatlantika for a reason, but to me, it's always been sort of a global development. I mean, history is like that, right? I mean, when I just read a lot of Emerson these days, and you can totally tell the guy read all the Asian philosophers and thinkers, right? And then what was the history of all that whole continent and all the people and different people who lived there. And at the same time, you have Tolstoy in Russia, and then Gandhi reading Tolstoy and being like, oh, that's the greatest thing ever, and calling his ashram in South Africa like Tolstoy farm. And so it's never been like so pure. And sometimes I find these debates over a little artificial, because it's a little like, yeah, okay, of course we sort of cross-seminate, if you want to call it, or there's norm diffusion, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Jason, go.
Well, I mean, like, you look at like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, even like the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like, it's beautiful writing, but in terms of like as an actual logical argument, like it's the kind of stuff that you fail Logic 101, right? Because you're assuming your priors, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Like that's your assumption, right? And then there is actual, like, that was, I think, part of like the East Asian pushback against like the so-called like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because like the argument fundamentally there was that like there is no universal, that's like a Western liberal project, right? Like the argument, I guess, is that East Asians prefer stability, right? Like one famous, like, I guess, parallel is that like I forget, was it the Qianlong Emperor? Like there was this famous case where the son committed either like a murder or some sort of sexual assault, and the father turned him in, and then the king punished the father, so basically by saying like, look, this is not the right way, because like there's a father and son relationship, right? And if the father doesn't follow the relationship with the son, then how can the citizen follow the relationship with the emperor, right? Which sounds very weird to, like, I guess, Western point of view, although I would say there are some Confucians that argue against that, but the entire argument there was that, like, okay, East Asia is a separate priority, right? Like, and we are going to do our own thing, and like all this like liberalism, women's right nonsense is just like Western busybodies being Western busybodies. Now, to what extent that's true, like, I mean, like, it was one of those things that went in favor and out of favor, and in favor and out of favor, and like it doesn't. I mean, the critique of democracy declining has been around since Plato, right? Like democracies all go to oligarchies.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I mean, so that's not new. So like, I mean, everybody's always complaining the system is failing. Is it failing? I don't know.
Well, I guess that's the history, and I mean, unfortunately, the 4 volumes aren't translated in English. That would be a big project to do that, but it's an amazing project, the history of the West. But that's what the history of the West is. It's like constant failures, huge violations of principles and values, right? But then also always people coming there and trying to sort of correct that. And sometimes at great sacrifice. And I think a lot of it is you can tell that story without the history of colonialism, for example, and of all these abuses, because that what motivated a lot of people to actually, leave everything else by the wayside and go fight for these ideas, because they're like, wait a second, this is not okay. I mean, John Stuart Mill was in India, right? He was working in the colonial administration of India, and he was one of the first who wrote on the subjection of women, first who wrote on women's rights, and one of the foundational thinkers of liberalism. I mean, if you read him now, if you read On Liberty now, I mean, I did this to someone, and the person was like, wait, this is from 18 whatever? It's like, it sounds like it was written yesterday, right? Because the issue is the same. So you're right. It's always like, since Plato and Aristotle, it's always been this sort of struggle. But as long as there is an opportunity for people to actually push back and have the feeling that they can actually make a difference, that's as long. Then the project still has a chance to continue, and that's disregarding AFDs, Brexits, Trumps, and whatnot. Right? In America, you always say the pendulum swings back at some point. Right, and it goes back and forth, and sometimes really boring because it's always the same blah. But sometimes we have these big moments, right, and then and big moments forward. The concern that I have that motivates our work here is, that the mechanism is broken, and then we have a real problem, because then the whole violation, the practices of Western states which violate the promises aren't checked. And this is actually, I mean, there are a lot of indicators that might serve as evidence for that, right, nowadays. And I think we could talk a long time about this. I want to actually get a bit more into the nitty-gritty details. I have some passages that I pulled out where I wanted to ask you what do you think about this. On the first one is on page 3 of what is that? And I just quote Professor Winkler now. He says, "We can no longer be sure whether the United States will be a democracy in a liberal sense in a few years' time, depending on the outcome of the presidential elections of 2024. End quote. That interview was conducted in 2022.
Mhm.
Do you think, what do you think? Brief
Well,
answers.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
so I've been reading more of like Curtis Yarvin just to try to like understand like what his mindset is, because I just see the Twitter blurb and it sounds insane, but like it's like his argument fundamentally. Okay, I'm summarizing, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but my understanding of his argument fundamentally is that like, look, we America has long since stopped being a liberal democracy. Like this is pre-Trump. We're already an oligarchy. The only way to save it is to do like, you know, basically an Augustus, have a Caesar, have him solve all the problems, be a big CEO, right? And then like I don't like succession. He's left clear on. Like this is models like a similar argument by like there's a Chinese philosopher / historian like Xiao Gongqian, who also argue that what China needs is an equivalent of an emperor, right? Like the oligarchy is here; it's already happened. And I guess like maybe there's a hypothetical argument there, which says that like, well, okay, we're growing older. Older people tend to be richer, so they're technically a gerontocracy, which is an oligarchy of sorts. And like, I mean, I just remain unconvinced. I feel like we go through the, again, like to go back to the pendulum thing, we swing through these things, right? Like, do I think there's too much executive power? Probably, but like the fact of the matter is that like, I mean, stuff is still going through the courts, right? We haven't like Trump hasn't has maybe he will have his Andrew Jackson moment, right? You know, like Supreme Court has made its decision, now let it enforce it. So far, he hasn't gone there yet. I mean, we'll see what happens. It's like, but
Great. Anthony, what do you think?
Yeah, so yeah, you bring up. Is it Curtis Yarvin? Is that his name? Like, I watched a podcast of him, and I remember him. And what's his other ego? Mulbug or something?
Yeah, like Mendes Mulbug or something like that.
Yeah,
but basically, the Dark Enlightenment is what they call themselves.
Yeah. When Trump was elected the first time, we had a study group of students who were all into that, and we did a research project on it for when I was teaching at a different university. And I remember when I read those folks, I actually think like they argue that there's like a natural hierarchy in the world. Like I think they're anti. Like in terms of what you're arguing, you actually Tim, and Yarvin, you have different conceptions of the West. I don't know. I mean, I think they believe there is like this natural hierarchy. Slavery is a good thing. Like women are subordinate to men. There's a certain kind of like way things are, and we've drifted. Like the U.S. Revolution, even the French Revolution, the rights of man is a bad idea. Like the idea that everybody has equal rights is a bad idea. I believe that that's their perspective, and I mean he's. I think he still promotes that kind of thinking, and to the degree to which it's present in the United States, like in government now, I don't know. It's like there's currents in the Trump movement. Like there's people who just support him because of making money, cutting taxes. There's people who are hoping to gain access to government contracts, and I bet there are people like the Yarvins and so on. And so, if the question though is right now, like if democracy survives, I mean, that's a tough question. Democracy means the people rule. That's it. So anything can really count for that. But how we talk about liberal democracy, it looks like, I mean, at least right now, the question is, and we're seeing this play out right now. I think it's a great comment from Winkler. It does appear to me that like power is trumping, to pun intended, power is trumping institutions. Like that's the concern. I don't know if it means like the death of the West or death of U.S. democracy, but power is, and this is the ongoing debate. Like, how do you I don't know if you say mitigate or how do you control power? That's what's happening. So this is what we're seeing, and the Trump, the alliance that is Trumpism, they're super astute at using power and bending institutions to their policy priorities, like the Supreme Court and the emergency docket stuff. That's amazing how they, like, there's been the idea that they essentially use the Supreme Court for a variety of things, including now trying to fire the governor on the board of the Federal Reserve. But what they've done with immigration in this regard, they're but they're bending institutions to their political project, which is power over institutions. That's not the first time this has happened in the United States. How long will this last? I mean, I don't know, but that's really what we're talking about. And I think that's what we're seeing. I don't know if that makes sense. Helps.
No, yeah, no. It's once again a lot of good stuff. I mean, you made a good point. Democracy basically means rule of the people, which means basically anything you want it to mean. And this is, I do a spiel of building up to the model of democracy that I always think is the Habermasian model, where we do direct democracy and how it doesn't work because too many people and it's just silly anyways. But liberal democracy then is basically that plus institutions, right? And this is sort of the frame I always draw around. And obviously, you're absolutely right that the Trump administration, especially in the second term here, is trying everything to make to use the courts, the law in its favor, and they're very effective at it. Because the thing obviously is that Democrats try that too. They might have been less effective last time. Also, maybe just the stars align better this time around, right? But what shows that there's still, I think, where Jason also, Jason has a very good point, is they still go through the effort to go through the laws, the courts, right? They try to bend the law, but that means there is a law. And you need to bend it, and you feel like you have to go and convince or have people on the Supreme Court. That means there's still a basic respect for these institutions, which I think is the ultimate backstop to the descent into whatever oligarchy, tyranny, dictatorship, or whatnot. And yes, of course, there are uncomfortable moments like right now when we hear that, they're pressuring like ABC to fire Jimmy Kimmel. And so we have another like great debate for this week because we're so bored. But again, I think, there's also that definition of democracy, the very minimal one where like democracy is when somebody else can become the next ruler, right? And that's basically all you need to have. As long as that's the case, then you're still in a democracy. I think that's much too thin, but it's still actually, there's a point to it. Here's another thing which I thought was an interesting anecdote. I heard it on the radio yesterday. There's a huge German insurer, and they do a survey, I think for the last 40 years, asking Germans. This is so awesome for Americans because it's the German angst. They actually ask Germans what they're afraid of every year. And the funny thing is that it was on the radio, and the reporter was like, well, what's surprising is that people actually a lot less afraid now that Donald Trump's going to like destroy the world, basically, or throw it into chaos, right? And he was like, well, the question is why, right? And his answer was like, well, it's probably because people just got used to it, right? And I was like, yeah, that's one answer, but it might also just be that people have realized that Donald Trump can't just do whatever he wants to, isn't the king of America. And actually the ones who are trying to put everybody or scare everybody are you people in the media, because it's more fun for you. You get more clicks, right? Trump, the first time around, was really not anything really crazy. I mean, he said crazy things all the time, but nothing really crazy happened. This time, okay. But I don't think it's the end of democracy.
No, and I think I guess maybe two things. One is that like the American president has I guess a lot of power, but within sort of the constraints of like he's still like as like if you were to look at just like an abstract like in terms of like as like sort of like the leader of the country, the American president is really, really constrained compared to something like the French president, right? And even like maybe not the German PM, but like definitely compared to like the UK prime minister or like the Indian prime minister, like the president is really constrained, even after all these decades of like more and more executive power. So like even if there's just like lots of constraints built into the American system, which is why we're dysfunctional. It looks like we're dysfunctional so much of the time, right? Like the fact that like we're just like an absolute train wreck is not like. And I understand when people like look at America, they're like, "That's what democracy is." Ooh, I don't know if I want that for us, right? Like because it's kind of a train wreck.
Yeah, Anthony.
I was gonna say, I think a couple of things. One is that there is a lot of. I really think there's a couple of things going on, but one key. I was actually talking to a friend of mine the other day about this, like what's going on, how people view the U.S. from the outside. I think if you look at a lot of U.S. foreign policy developments, it looks like Trump is quite restrictive, like Russia and China, particularly like, and then tariffs, like the tariff debates. Honestly, I know, Tim, you read the Wall Street Journal, but you go to the business section, like every day, basically all businesses are reporting losses, right? They're always, and it's because of tariffs. Like they're just losing, right? So all the manufacturers, Stellantis, at least the car manufacturers, these are the companies that U.S. is supposed to be winning, and they're not, and they're reporting like they're just not winning, right? So like, it looks like in a lot of ways from the outside, it looks like Trump's running up against real barriers. But then on the inside, if you're in the United States on the inside, there is things like the Kimmel thing is like, I think people are like really like, what the hell's going on? How can he do this? The other thing is like immigration is a huge thing, like the enforcement stuff. He is really going after interior enforcement, which is something that has not happened really before, like not to this degree. Like I don't mean shutting the border down. I mean like going the number of workplace enforcement actions, like going to farms. Trump was president the first time, he never did a raid on a farm. And the idea was like, oh, we know there's people here who don't have status, but they're needed on farms. Half of farm labor in the U.S. is undocumented. He's going onto farms now and arresting people. This is not like bluster. He's doing it, and he's deporting people. And the numbers show it. Arrests, deportations, this is real. The New York Times did an article a couple of days, or actually a few weeks ago, about this. Like the numbers are there. He's doing it, and he plans on doing more of it the next 3 years. So this is why people are self-deporting. That's a big deal. That's like I thought this was the nation of immigrants. That's not like. And then you have people like Stephen Miller saying we want 100. You know, we don't. He had some figure like we don't need that many people in this country. 100,000 maybe. Like that's a different view. That's more of the Yarvin view, like kind of winning out. So I say that because I think internally. Like, and then I should say another thing I would add, and this is like a cultural thing. If you go through the news, go through cable news, which is how representative it is, I don't know, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and if you watch those, do your study. But like 10 years ago, they kind of reported the same news, like things in the world, what's going on with slight variation. Now they're different. Like MSNBC and CNN, they're basically reporting the same thing. Fox News is entirely separate. Fox News is on an island. Like every morning they have like lifting up ICE. They're saying ICE they're heroes. They're doing immigration enforcement. It's a great time protecting the nation. Nothing like that on the other networks. How representative of cable news is of the U.S. population is another question, but there's cultural change. There's a lot of stuff going on in the U.S. that's like quite significant. And how it plays out, I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, yeah, this is a great segue into the next point. And I mean, we've seen that polarization of the media for a while, right? And the immigration stuff, I hope we have a whole separate forum on that as well. But yes, and the question is, does the media sort of push the polarization, or is it just a reflection, right? What's the cause and effect relationship? So that's where the causal errors go. That's another interesting question. But I want to come back to the interview because Heinrich August Winkler actually makes a point saying that, and I quote again, my second one, he says, if we ask why this development has occurred, so sort of the crisis of democracy, why of all things the first modern large-scale democracy experiences such a decay of its own normative projects, then we cannot avoid talking about what could be called the original lie of American democracy, the repressed racism. And he basically makes another point then later on about Trumpism, that it's being sort of a perverse interpretation of the founding promise of the United States of America. Sort of, it becomes a thing of white male supremacy, and says that the problem, the crisis of democracy, the polarization is just really, really bad in the United States as compared to other Western countries, and by that he means Western Europe. And you were talking about how the US looks from the outside, and then from the inside, but now I kind of want to reverse it because I'm sitting here in Germany. I want to ask the Americans how Europe looks from the outside, and then I'm going to tell you how it looks like from the inside. I mean, do you think he's right? I mean, it's, again, the interview was done 2022, and a lot of things have changed since then. Do you think he's right that it's just much worse in the United States than in Europe?
No,
Jason.
no. I mean, like, American history is like we fought 2 civil wars. Like, I mean, we're not like, I mean, like, we say like, yeah, political violence isn't part of our culture, but it pretty much has been part of our culture since the founding of the country, right? Alexander Hamilton, Lincoln, you know, like Hayes, I think, as well. Like, I mean, like, we've had political assassinations, and it wasn't even that long ago, right? We had MLK, RFK, right? Reagan. So part of it is like, it's just, I mean, we have this belief of like, this is like, I tend to think of like the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, they're aspirational things, right? Like, I mean, we've gone through these cycles where we just like, we go pro-immigrant, anti-immigrant, right? We had the Chinese Exclusion Act. We had like, you know, during World War II, we let in all the Jews. And also like, you have the situation where we're just like, we just constantly swing back and forth, right? Like Andrew Jackson, he was elected on the idea that like he was going to be this big sort of democratic, like, I guess, a big protective democracy, right? This is a guy who would allow those non-landowning whites to vote, right? He kind of expanded the tent that way. We don't think of him that way nowadays. Now we think of more of like the Trail of Tears. But like, I mean, and after World War II, we expanded the vote further. I think, was it 1870 we allowed African Americans to vote, and then like 1920 was women's. I mean, so it's just a story of like we have this ideal that we aspire to. Like, have you read All Star Superman? Like, no, but there's this line in there where Jor-El is telling Kal-El, you know, it's like they will stumble, they will fall, but in time they will join you in the sun, right? That's the kind of like, so you have this like aspirational idea of like, this is what America wants to be, and we just screw it up all the time. Right. And a lot of it's just like, because we have different ideas of what that means. So a lot of it's just like the way we resolve it is yelling at each other, and sometimes, unfortunately, violence. Like,
well, but but his point is, yeah, you yell a lot and you have all these terrible wars, the ones who just like sort of, and now it's really bad, the polarization. I actually want to add real quick, we had the 30 Years War. It wasn't just called that, it was 30 years.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, it's like
the population of Germany was gone afterwards.
I mean,
that's one of those. Actually, I'm from the country that started both of those world wars, right? Just saying, real quick. We had revolutions, boy.
Yeah.
Is the question though, how does Europe seem to us?
Well, yeah. Well, no, the thing is and it actually sometimes drives me mad when I have a conversation with people here in Germany. They are, and that's not Professor Winkler, that's other people on the street. They're like, oh, the Americans, that's like crazy, right? We're way more relaxed and chill than the Americans. I mean, they got Trump, that's nuts. Like, they do all these crazy things. We don't do that. And sometimes I'm just like, yeah, it's your view of America, and it's also the press likes to do that. And I think a lot of times it's also just a big distraction from what happens here in Europe. So that's my perspective.
I have 2 things. Like, I'm thinking like, I'm trying to think like, what do I think? And then there's from, you know, following the news, and what do I think other Americans think who don't really follow the news? So the question about Europe and how Europe's seen, I think most people in the US don't care. Like, they just don't care. They don't care about Europe. Sorry, it's just like they don't pay attention. Like, they'll see Trump is in England now, and they'll like turn the channel. It's like, whatever. Now that's one thing. So I think that's part of the reality. The second thing is, or maybe some people, especially people I think who follow Trump, they do like the idea, like the idea that he says, like, oh, we're going to get European countries to pay more for NATO. They're like, yeah, I like that. Even though people don't understand how NATO works, they're going to be like, yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah, we're being cheated. Yeah, these takers, these Europeans. I think people like that idea. Not everybody, but some people do. So those are some general opinions that are not very well thought up. I think those things exist. Now what I think that the way I've understood it is, like, I think World War II, because World War II destroyed Europe and the Holocaust happened in Europe, it was a huge thing and it really resonated in Europe. And this is my understanding. So it resonated, and I think it characterized political institutions, social relations for decades. And I think you see this. I don't know. Well, you have tons of laws in Germany. But then in other places too, like you have these fascists in Italy who basically have, I can't remember their names. They have no following. And like in France too, like Marine Le Pen, her father, like he starts the National Rally or National Front or whatever, and he's around, but he doesn't have much of a following, right? But they change in the 80s and 90s, and they can really mainstream going on, right? Like, just say mainstream, really, like the immigrant sentiment, maybe racism and so on. This is where maybe part of what in the article or the interview Winkler talks about Brexit. Like, there's the cunning of, I don't know what you want to call them, right-wing forces to really come back, and the left has no response to it. And I think that's gives me pause. Like, that's something I never thought I would see. Like, or I should say, maybe I never thought I would see, but something that is definitely like innovative, and that's continental, like Germany, Spain, Britain. I was talking to somebody yesterday. They said, like, is it the Reform Party in Britain? It's like dominant, and like what? Like Nigel Farage and like this guy. What's going on here? Like, you can go across the board. The rise, and not just the rise of the right. People talk about the rise of the right 10 years ago in Europe. It's not just rising; it's consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's there. So,
yeah. It's not Europe. It's not just Europe too. It's
but great points. I have too many things written down. So yes, there was a protest march in London, I think.
Yeah.
With like far right extremists, right? And it's 100,000 people. It wasn't like 1,000 or 500, 100,000 people, the largest ever. Right. And I was like, what? I mean, I am the European, but I was like, first point real quick. I actually gonna throw this out there. Germans and Europeans don't really care about Americans either. That's the funny part. They just like love sort of the punching back. It's like good when you're like, oh, others are more crazy than we are or more stupid than we are. It's also very arrogant, especially in Germany. There's a lot of arrogance in there. But if they would actually care, they would try to understand the country and not just constantly say the same thing they just hear on the news, right? They would try to get their own perspective. Part of what we do is try to sort of change that for both sides, I hope. That's why we want to do a Germany book too. Yes, I would say that and this is the main theme of Transatlantika. The crisis is bad on both sides, right? And you're absolutely right. They're not just rising. That was a while ago. They have arrived, right? They are in the mainstream now. The parties don't want to really, like, the other parties don't want to acknowledge that. But we just had the statewide elections here in our state, in North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the most populous state. And when you read the news the next day, they're like, oh my God, the SPD, the Social Democrats, is sort of their home country, their core, like everything. They lost, and they actually lost just 2%. The Green Party lost almost 8%, right? They are running it with the Conservatives right now, or used to run it. And the thing that nobody really wants to talk about, well, they had to at some point, is that the AfD tripled its votes compared to last time, right? And this is something like, I mean, in the US, because you have a different electoral system, you see it much more radical. And I think there's something about the cliche that everything is more extreme in the United States. I think I mentioned that before. I always tell people like, oh, the US is 5 years ahead of us for better or worse, right? But I think we are really good at catching up, right? And if you look at France, which just lost its, third prime minister, I think, and is basically completely paralyzed because Marine Le Pen, yes, has cast out her dad, who's dead now anyways, but basically pushed him to the side to basically mainstream and change the name of the party. And we have Italy, where Miss Meloni is completely accepted now at all the international conferences, G8 meetings, Davos and whatnot, and just rolling her eyes at Friedrich Merz, our chancellor, which is one of the funniest clips I've seen. So, but yeah, I think in 2022 maybe, but I think it's clear now that we're both going through the same sort of crisis moment, right? So yes, Jason.
Yeah, I guess I would also point out like it's not just like Europe, right? You have Japan, like you have like the far right, or I guess you're right. You have far right Shinsedo movement. You have India, Modi as prime minister, Erdogan as well. Like, and also I would argue that like maybe you look at like how long has the Fifth Republic been around? What, 50, 60 years? Right? Like it hasn't like, I mean, you look at like the history of France, the history of Europe in general, maybe it's not like, maybe like the so-called like the period of peace is the exception, right? Because Europe, we know, was the most violent continent like on the planet for a very, very long time, right? America is an artificial country, right? We were created synthetically, like, but I mean, the European countries trace back centuries, thousands of years, and like their history has broadly been like, I mean, is this more of like a return to kind of like how Europe naturally is? Like, I guess that's the controversial, like throw it out there, like you're just returning to, I mean, like what the aberration is not the fact that you have these far right parties and like nationalistic parties rising. The aberration is that they've been at bay for so long.
Yes, that's a good point. I would say, well, that's because otherwise I wouldn't believe in my own argument, but I would say no, that's not the cause. I think, and I just wrote this down, I think in general, as Anthony was saying in the beginning of the conversation, yes, the West has basically sort of spread around the world. It's a global thing, for better or worse, again, right? The international system, we both studied and taught international relations, is based on Western norms, and they have been put there by violence and force, no question about it. And this is what, and I think ultimately the West might be losing its attractive appeal around the world, and that's why it's opening up space for these authoritarian alternatives, because that the mechanism isn't working. It's not, people don't see how they can bring the aspirations, how they can reach those aspirations again. They see that the practices are continuously, that it's hypocritical, and I wouldn't blame them. I think the German foreign policy has been as hypocritical as it gets, pretty much, right? And it's really difficult to sort of, I think people are trying to realign it with sort of actual Western values, but it's very difficult. So this is, in my opinion, the reason why it's failing. The West, the best way for the West to win is not with cannons, but by leading by example. And that means sometimes taking the cannons back and, putting, what was the thing, Klaus? And
the swords to
plowshares. Yes, exactly.
Very good magic card.
But right now, and actually, I mean, do you guys have like one more, or do you need to go? I have an IR one. But the last one, I mean, we can actually end on that note, but that's because there's more to come. And the second part of the interview is more about Germany. It's actually about the very sort of painful process through which Germany, also a very artificial state in a way, right, constructed in the process of 3 wars, right, sort of hundreds of kingdoms. But the final point that I think Winkler makes, and there I actually agree with him very much, is that he's talking about Charles Krauthammer. Most people don't know anymore who that is. And the unipolar moment, right? And that, which was sort of, for a brief moment in time, people, and especially in the IR community, it was a big discussion whether there was a unipolar moment. If the United States was the sole superpower on the planet after the bipolar period of the Cold War. And Professor Winkler says, well, this is like this, maybe it never happened. And the West in general has lost a lot of its power. But we're basically back in a international system that's characterized by multipolarity. That means different centers of power, meaning maybe China, Russia, a small center with a big guy. But and the problem obviously is that well, not obviously, but if you do IR theory, then that's basically an introductory class, is that bipolar is stable, according to John Mersheimer. Why we're not going to get into unipolarity can also be stable because you have a big hegemon no one dares to really challenge. But multipolarity is actually a system very prone to conflict, right? And I think that's where he's pretty spot on, right? We've seen a lot more conflict. People have already, Don Miller already talked about the end of war, and that's definitely not the case. So, any final words? Because I've kept you way too long on that one.
I guess my controversial take is I'm not entirely convinced the unipolar moment's over, just different. Like, and I don't want to get into it now, but like, yeah, like, I just don't think it's just changing. That's how I would describe it.
Okay, so I gotta take. Yeah, go.
I think it's like it's up and down. I was having this conversation with my students the other day about like American decline. When would we ask that question, and how do you ask that question? It's like Robert Cohen, another IR theorist, says it's in the Stephen Krasner, another realist. He says Vietnam, and then you have people raising that question again after Iraq. Then you have people raising that question after Afghanistan. You have particularly around military moments. Like, is there a moment of American decline? Then does America come back? I mean, it's like at the current moment, I think there's arguments for the multipolar thing, like that Russia's doing what it's doing. That seems to apparent. But I mean, I don't know. It seems somewhat anecdotal. I don't know. I mean, but I think I could see that argument being made. But again, that argument's been made. And then there's a question of unipolarity, even bipolarity, but it's such a rare thing. Like World War II, its impact on Europe was so rare and so extreme, contrary to the United States, which had no destruction. Like that moment, 1940 to 1970, was so short. 1945, 1950 to 1970. Like the rebuilding of Europe and the power it gave the United States was so strange. And that's like the golden age. I think even in the United States, like this golden age of development and stuff, it's such a small period of time in history. So,
because I would just, the one statistic I would point to is that America right now is around a quarter of the world's, I think, GDP or consumption or production. Like, and it's basically been that way since post-Civil War up until like that big spike after World War II. So like it's just more reverting to trend than like, so. And the fact that the rest of the world is catching was great, because it'd be awful if we were still in the same position we were after World War II.
Right. But no, okay, I think that's something to think about for future, or have maybe even a future discussion about. Is the unipolar moment over? Was there a unipolar moment ever? Do we actually care?
Yeah.
Does it make sense to have theories of history in that way? Because history doesn't really, repeat, which is kind of what I take away from Anthony's point, which is a very, very good point, a very unique moment in history, or that short, brief time. But for now, I want to thank you. I really didn't, I was really a bit worried we wouldn't have enough to talk about. And I think we could have easily done a 2-day conference on this, 5 pages, stimulate. So for everybody who's been watching, thanks a lot for joining. And if you, yes, go read the article. It's really worth your time, I think. So thanks a lot and see you next time.